Hello and welcome to Lit Illuminated. I'm Rebecca Beardsall, and this is a space for us to look at books, the way that we enter into books and the way that books inform us, give us insights on ourselves and the way that we are connected. And today we are going to be looking at Kerri Dochartaigh's Cacophony of Bone, The Circle of a Year. And I want to just talk briefly about how I came to this book. A friend of mine picked it up when she was on a trip over in London, showed me the cover of what she purchased, and I was like, "Ooh, that looks really interesting." When I looked it up and saw that it was related to, 2020 and the start of the pandemic, I was like, "Oh, I'm not interested." I really didn't want to enter into another story of that time period. Not that there's anything wrong with having stories of that. It just felt like there was so much out there already that was produced during that time. And so I didn't do it. And later in my other podcast where I work with my friends, Colleen and Athena, we have a podcast called Nothing is Wrong with You. And we are the book podcasters on YouTube. And in that space, my friend Athena said that she really loved the way that Doherty used the language and theme and the methodology that she used to share her story. So that convinced me to go out and buy the book. And I'm so glad I did, because while the story happens during the pandemic, that isn't the main thing. There are moments of it where she talks about, feeling isolated or alone. They're in a cottage themselves and kind of struggling in that space a little, but the bulk of the conversation and the bulk of the story is really about her looking at the world around her. But there was one note, and this is the last thing I'm going to say about the pandemic in this review of this and this conversation of this, is that on page 59, she just kind of just says, "It feels like we are learning how to be human again, harrowing but essential work." And I just thought that was a really interesting thing, because I know that was part of the conversations I was having around that time, that we were moving into a space to understand community a little bit better, how to come together and support each other. Unfortunately, we've gone up and down in that space, and sometimes all the way the opposite. But those are just my thoughts on that. So what I want to say about this book is that it was a beautiful way of writing a memoir and using themes. And in it, the methodology she uses here is essentially a monthly. Each section is based on a month, and then in that, it's a daily recording. So it's like we're reading her journal in some way, obviously edited and precise in what she wants to say there, and not general musings. But there are times where it is like that. But really, where she uses theme, that pulls us through as the reader throughout. And I'm just going to share a couple of those. So she uses the sea, the ocean and water and swimming as a theme, and a connection there to her body. Lots of birds, which I love. I'm so obsessed with them right now as I go out on my walks, and I'm constantly paying attention to birds and owls and whatever's around me in that space. And she kind of does that same thing, which I think is beautiful. The light, and she starts with the light early on in the book, and the way that light informs how you're seeing, and also how it can open up spaces that you didn't recognize there before in yourself, but also in the space around you. She's just some very beautiful lines on light. And then another one that she goes into is grief. And early on, the grief is different to what it is later, and this kind of movement from grief to something else. And I'll get into that in a second. And then the writing life, what it means to be a writer, to be sitting in this space, and the struggles and the joys and and the issues there. At the time of this book, she is editing her first book, Thin Places, I believe it's called. And so we have moments here where she's working on it, the book comes out, and all that exciting things in there. So on one level, I think this is a really interesting study on the way memoir and telling our stories can utilize themes. And as writers, we often think, "Ooh, I need to do that in my story." And as I work not only in my own memoir writing, but also with coaching clients, I'm also reminding them that you don't have to worry about that right now. Just write what you need to write. Write the stories that you have inside you and you need to get out. Those themes are going to appear to you. And sometimes they might not even appear to you even through the editing process. It might be something that comes to you from somebody else, which happened to me. My memoir, The Unfurling Frond, I have some tree themes throughout. And I was, consciously thinking about that. But it wasn't until later when one of my beta readers and later editors were like, "Whoa, I love how you connected it here and here and here." And I was like, "Oh, I didn't even notice that when I was in the writing and the compiling and the putting in that space." And so this is where, don't worry about it so much as a writer. If you are a writer and you are interested in you writing memoir, your themes will come through no matter what, because that is what's inside you, and that's just what you're observing about life around you or your past. And a good editor is going to help you pull those out, or at least notice how to place them within the book itself, so that it keeps this consistent movement and this like, oh, we're back to that, that moment for the reader. But I felt like this was a really good example of how themes can pull you through a book, and you can have multiples. And the ones that I listed, life, sea, grief, writing life, and birds, are just a few of them. I feel like she has many more in this book that take you through the story itself. So I could go on about all the different, like take you through some of the different themes, like light and the way that she uses that. But I feel like it's something you want to experience on your own, and I don't want to take you to each of those spaces. But there was one thing that I kept writing throughout that I felt as a writer that I really felt seen, and it makes you again know that you are connected to other authors and into the space of books and words. And this was about one of her writing spaces, and she talks about this a few times. So on page 76, she says, "I try to write of my need, my desire, but I fail." And there are a few lines like that where she talks about, I try to write this, I want to express this in my writing, and I fail. And that is something I've experienced myself. I often get frustrated by that, and you can see in the book itself how she gets frustrated in that space, that there's something inside you that needs to come out. And every time you go to write about it, because you're like, this needs to get out of me, it doesn't quite hit the mark. And I relate this to when I was first learning photography, and I would have this vision of what the photo would look like in my head. I would set it up, I get the people where they need to be, I take the picture, and then later on when I get it developed, because this was back in the day before digital, I was like, oh, that is nothing like what I was seeing. I love the instant connection with digital now, that you can go like, oh no, that didn't work, this is where we need to change it. So much of it is about like angle and lighting. There's these other components that come in, that it's not just the straight like, this is getting these positions, I'm going to take this picture and it's going to be perfect, the tree's here, you're there, whatever. But it's all the things that come together to make it very dynamic. And I feel like she talks a lot about that in this book about the writing life, and how even though she's writing it and there are beautiful ways that she's expressing what she's feeling and what's going on in her life, she still feels like she's failing. And so it just felt to me like I felt so seen and understood and connected, that this is kind of a process of being a writer, that sometimes that feeling of the words aren't working, they're not really expressing what I want to express, And that is part of the process. That's part of kind of going back and writing through it. And so I think what is so lovely about this book is that it is like a journal. It is, based on her daily thoughts and what's going on. She starts each chapter with like an overview of the month and then goes into, or either an overview of the month or essentially like taking you from one month to the next and what's kind of the big themes that are going on. And then you go down into these daily spaces. And so I really appreciated that she was vulnerable throughout, which takes me to the grief theme. And early on, she is talking about her grief of not having children. And this starts very early in the book, and you kind of move through this space of her trying to talk about, write about, process this grief while living now in this remote space and, being away from people and just there with her partner. But then it moves to the decision that, they're going to have children, and eventually she gets pregnant. And so the book towards the end, is walking through her pregnancy. And for me, and this is why I think it's really important to talk about books. Is for me, that's not my life story. I don't have children, so sometimes when books get into that space of what it means to be pregnant and the feelings in that space, it's outside my realm of experience. However, it doesn't mean that I don't connect with the book. And I think this is what's so important, especially as memoir writers. We often think, well, who's going to read this? Who's going to care about my story? The thing is, we don't have to have lived your story to want to hear about it and or want to walk through those moments with you and to dive into the space of the words and the way that language creates these worlds that we then experience what you're going through, what you went through in a space that is outside our own experience. And this is just where, we are connected, and that books in some way reflect ourselves as well as reflect back to the writer of who they are and where they've been. So for me, the early part with the grief could have been anything, because she didn't start saying what the grief was. I don't believe early on. It was more just walking through grief. And we all walk through grief in different ways. And this is often, I teach several different workshops that talk about grief and writing in grief and books about grief, just because that's my own experience. So even though her grief was about not having children, which in some way I did have to go through myself, like recognize that even though it was my decision not to, that at some point I had to go, okay, what does that really mean, and process that on my own. And so I think sometimes even self-inflicted grief in that space is a process. But I've also had other moments of grief, of loss. And so I was instantly connected to that space. And if you've been following me at all, you know that I love time. And so she talks about time in this space and the way that like owls and nature are connected within time, and then trees as well in that space. And so that interconnection with nature and the things that I love was just perfect. I think the last thing I want to say about this is that I feel like it is a good study in form that's different. And it's also an interesting study in the use of themes and a way to see how you can share your story without it being a full blown, like start to finish arc of a narrative, like more like a fiction reading, but to slowly take someone through your time, through your space, as she does in this way of a year, moving us through the year with her, how it started and how the year ended, was just a lovely way to allow us into her space, but without having to be like, now let me tell you everything there is about my life. She chooses what past comes into this space and what doesn't. And the use of themes is what holds it all together and allows the reader to connect in the ways that they're going to connect. Because I feel like if you come to this book, the themes that you're probably going to pull out, because I think there are so many, are going to be totally different to mine. I immediately connected with the light, the idea of how the light plays, around us in the world, the idea of the birds, because again, I'm obsessed with them, and the sea. That's something I write about a lot too, the water and that connection to that space, and the way that the sea connects us, but also reminds us of who we are. And then the grief. So those are obvious themes for me, and that writing life struggle. So I encourage you to check out the book again, Cacophony of Bone, a cycle of a year. And even if you feel like that seems outside of my area of interest, like the themes throughout, I'd say pick it up to look at it as a study of form and the way that she uses a year and the journaling kind of methodology to take us through not only her life, what's happening on, but then giving us insights to what's happening in the world, and what's happening within her family, and what is happening within nature during that time. So thank you again for joining me, and I look forward to chatting to you again with another book soon.